Hello, dear friends. My name is Anastasia Badaeva and I am a neurologist, a systemic nutritionist with Russian and British qualifications. Assistant at the Department of Pathological Physiology at Sechenov University in Moscow, coordinator of the Neuronutritionist direction, as well as a person who is insanely passionate about the topic of brain health. I am very happy to talk to you today about the fascinating and relevant topic of stress management. Our meeting is not called by chance, you can cope with it. This phrase can be interpreted in two ways. On the one hand, let's imagine a person with symptoms such as constant fatigue, poor sleep, and increased anxiety. Mood swings, physical and mental tension are also observed. He seeks help from a specialist and receives a diagnosis of high levels of stress. The main recommendation for such a diagnosis is more rest and sleep. It is believed that a person is able to cope with this on his own. Unfortunately, in most cases, such a recommendation is perceived by a person as a devaluation of anxiety processes in his body and does not lead to the desired changes in behavior. On the other hand, we can really deal with it if we understand the complex biochemistry that goes on in our brains. And this is a positive view of the current problem of stress management. To understand how to deal with this, we need to understand that our brains are involved in adapting the body to changes in the environment. By the way, I recently participated in the Brain Health Summit in Brussels. Because one of my trainings at the moment is dedicated to ambassadorship in the topic of brain health. So, it is important to say that for a long time it was assumed that the brain perceives external stimuli and regulates the state of our internal environment, and we cannot always influence the processes taking place in the brain. There are a lot of such incentives in the life of a modern person from a metropolis. Acute stress is used by the brain to perceive both difficult life events and traumas, as well as positive events. Like, for example, moving to another country, our brain is evolutionarily accustomed to react to acute stress. Let's imagine our ancient ancestors, when ancient man saw some kind of danger. To survive, he had one of three reactions: fight, run, or freeze. But what we face in the 21st century is the vast amount of chronic, social, and environmental stress that humans and their brains are exposed to. Both evolutionarily formed areas of the brain responsible for vegetative reactions and aspects of higher nervous activity are affected. It is important to say that these are not only impacts related to some social factors, for example, financial well-being or social and professional fulfillment. We have seen with the example of the coronavirus pandemic how social isolation has negatively affected a person's quality of life and their level of anxiety. And in the long term, it even affected his life expectancy. However, external environmental factors are also stressors. Every day we receive a huge amount of information flows. According to average estimates, a modern person receives such a volume of information per day that in the 18th century could receive in several years. In comparison, the processes of brain adaptation are much slower. Look at how much time we spend on gadgets every day. Almost all gadgets have information about screen time. Of course, many people use them for work, but we don't notice how we overload ourselves on weekends. When we scroll through social networks in pursuit of dopamine separately, it is worth adding at the physiological level, toxins in the environment increase the load on the body. Other physiological stressors are chronic low-level systemic inflammation, obesity, and disruption of circulation. circadian rhythms. We will talk about the latter today, so all this information gets into the brain, and then everything depends on individual differences in the vulnerability of the brain. They are dictated by our genetic predisposition, upbringing, development, and experience that we have received, and on the basis of the synthesis of these factors, an adaptive or maladaptive behavioral reaction arises in response to some influence. From time to time, we hear such a word as homeostasis. This is the constancy of the internal environment of the body. In addition to the term homeostasis, a new term elastasis is being formed in the modern scientific field. Thanks to it, it is estimated what allostatic load the brain faces based on external information and its internal state. The synthesis of these two things allows you to determine a person's adaptation to stress. It is this desire for adaptation that is one of the modern tasks of increasing the duration and quality of life at the expense of brain health. The World Health Organization considers brain health to be more than just the absence of neurological diseases, but a state that allows a person to fully realize his potential during life. Further, we will see that all stress management techniques are to one degree or another aimed at increasing the adaptive capabilities of a person. Let's see what are the common mechanisms of stress management techniques. Once again, I would like to say that stress by its nature is neither good nor bad. Endocrinologist Hans Selye studied stress in detail and believed that the ability to react to stress in one way or another determines what color stress will be colored for us. From an evolutionary point of view, stress in general is a kind of inducer of evolutionary processes. But when this stress becomes prolonged, it goes from a positive state to a destructive one. And at this point, we already begin to think about how we can help our central nervous system adapt. Of course, if we start asking what people mean by stress management, probably one of the first things you hear is about techniques, relaxation, meditation, and breathing. Yes, it is. These exercises aim to turn on the parasympathetic nervous system in our nervous system. Let me remind you that we have a sympathetic nervous system, which is activated as a defense in response to stressful situations, and a sympathetic pair, which is normally triggered when we sleep and eat. The inability to switch between the two systems dictates the aspects of increasing chronic stress. Modern scientific research proves that positive social interaction, when we get pleasure and experience love, of course, has a positive effect on the central nervous system. We understand that these mechanisms work through the amazing neurochemistry of our brains and are implemented through certain neurotransmitters. For example, dopamine is a neurotransmitter of achievement. Many teens get fast dopamine when they scroll through their social media feeds. Oxytocin rises when we hug each other and have bodily contact. Serotonin is a mood mediator. Many people with severe depression may have problems related to impaired serotonin synthesis and utilization. And this raises a natural question: can nutrition and nutrients in parallel with all spiritual practices, physical activity, and aspects of relaxation and pleasure affect this complex mechanics, which in the modern world is called the psychoneuroimmunoendocrine system? After all, in fact, our body is more than the sum of our organs. The immune, endocrine, and nervous systems are interconnected. And the long-term impact of stress on hormones and the work of higher centers affects not only a narrow structure of the brain, but, of course, changes the architecture of the entire state of the body. And for this, of course, we need to turn to the evidence base for the use of nutrients for the so-called stress resistance. What the evidence base implies is the ability to get a fairly clear, statistically significant answer that a particular nutrient has its own neurochemical and metabolic effects, and is not just a placebo effect. As a neurologist, I periodically encounter placebos in my medical practice. From a medical point of view, the placebo effect is not always a bad thing. But if we're talking about improving cognitive resilience and focus and brain health, you want to be sure that the substances you use have neurochemical effects. And, of course, first of all, I would like to say that there is a fairly large evidence base for magnesium. Magnesium is a fairly well-known nutrient that has been used by neurologists for more than 10 years. Now we see a large number of effects that go beyond its basic properties related to the ability to reduce spasms. We see the anti-inflammatory effect of magnesium, the ability to reduce anxiety, and improve sleep. Next, we will consider this with you. The next interesting question is related to the effect of different amino acids on neurotransmitter imbalances. This aspect is studied by neuronutritionology. It combines aspects of food culture, dietary schemes, and nutrients. It is important to say that amino acids are involved in the formation of neurotransmitters. Thanks to modern scientific data, we seem to see glycine from a new side, although we have been hearing about it in the scientific field for a long time. There is also an interesting look at the amazing molecule L-theanine, which is found in green tea and which we will talk about in more detail today. We will consider stress management through one of the most unique products that have been on the market for a long time, but, in my opinion, are underestimated. Despite its multiple properties, this is a well-known stress relief product, from the name of which it is clear that we are talking about effective molecules to protect the nervous system from possible overload and normalize sleep. Let's take a closer look at this product to understand how it affects biochemical processes. First of all, it is impossible to overestimate how magnesium affects our nervous system. If we open a biochemistry textbook, we will see that magnesium is involved in a huge number of biochemical processes. But the unique ability of magnesium is that it can combine with other molecules and thereby create a synergistic effect. In this product, we see magnesium in the form of glycinate. This form shows a very high bioavailability and the ability to influence the transition of our nervous system from an active sympathetic state to a parasympathetic one, thereby relieving tension. It is also important to say that one of the goals of neuronutritionology is the balance between the gut and the brain. There is an opinion that the gut and brain are connected only through prebiotics and probiotics. In fact, this is not the case, and therefore there is lactoprotein in the product. It is a biologically active protein that it is through its effect on the intestinal axis that the brain can have a mild calming effect. Of course, the more elements are inside an effective complex for stress protection, the more targets are affected. Therefore, the product also contains L-theanine, which I have already mentioned. And a little later we will see in which conditions L-theanine has the greatest effect. And since we learn a lot from nature, the product also contains a complex of plants that stabilizes the emotional background. The properties of St. John's wort extract became known long before the advent of modern biochemistry, because medicine appeared many centuries ago, and people have long tried to find natural remedies that stabilize the nervous system. Let's take a closer look at the L-theanine molecule, which is associated with the homeostasis of brain neurochemistry. The L-theanine molecules from green tea have a huge number of effects on our bodies. In 2022, placebo-controlled studies were conducted in which one group of people received the active molecule and the other group received a dummy. This approach makes it possible to compare the results of the two groups at the end of the study and exclude the influence of the very fact of taking the nutrient on the behavioral level. It turned out that 200 milligrams of L-theanine daily for 4 weeks reduced anxiety, depression, and improved sleep quality in healthy adults. emphasizing that 4 weeks for components related to stress regulation is a fairly quick effect. For example, the effect of magnesium intake can sometimes be seen only after 2 or 3 months. It is also important to note that these studies worked with healthy people. There are a large number of studies whose participants have diseases, and the results of such studies are difficult to transfer to healthy people. On the other hand, in addition to the main effect affecting the quality of sleep, the L-theanine molecule, there is also the potential to affect the protection of the heart, kidneys, and liver. Also on the components of immunoregulation. Aspects of immunoregulation are related to the central nervous system, where the helpers of our neurons, glial cells, are located. Let's test the data. We have to make sure once again that the unique molecule in stress relief is actually having an effect. Let's say there is a person who complains of sleep disorders or a decrease in its quality, as well as overload and difficulty falling asleep due to constant thoughts in his head. How will our product help him? L-theanine in the product is to some extent a precursor for the formation of the very important neurotransmitter gamma-aminobutyric acid. This acid is associated with the work of the parasympathetic nervous system, which we want to learn to turn on in the evening to relax. We remember that during the day, we need the sympathetic nervous system to perform various tasks at work and at home. A natural question arises: why can't you just drink green tea if L-theanine is contained in it? Because in the context of precision neuronutrient support, dosages are critically important to us. So, 1 cup of ordinary green tea contains about 20 milligrams of the L-theanine molecule. It turns out that you need to drink at least 10 cups of tea to get the daily rate. But along with tea, we will also get caffeine, which has an unnecessary stimulating effect. In the context of the study of L-theanine, a systematic review and meta-analysis was published in 2025. What is it? We collected all existing studies on this molecule and once again calculated its effectiveness in terms of statistical data. Well, what the research has shown is that there is an improvement in subjective sleep quality in the first place. Today there are a huge number of gadgets for assessing sleep. For example, I have an Oura smart ring. With the help of gadgets, we can track the phase of deep sleep quite accurately. Find out if we have dreams, but in this process you should not rely only on numbers. It is important to subjectively feel better, and 2 molecules have been shown to reduce the time it takes to fall asleep. This is a very common problem. Gadgets can also help track this parameter because they accurately record when a person goes to bed and the beginning of sleep. The gadget reads the change in thermoregulation and heartbeat characteristic of sleep. The 3-L-theanine increases total sleep duration. Some people face such a problem as night awakenings, which in the morning give a feeling of fatigue and lethargy. In addition, it negatively affects susceptibility to stress. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that at the moment the most studied effective doses are 200 milligrams per day. Although I recently came across a new study that will examine the dose-dependent effects of L-theanine. After all, modern research is increasingly coming to the conclusion that more does not mean better. Returning to magnesium, there has recently been evidence that in order to form serotonin and gamma-aminobutyric acid, we need not just substrates, but cofactors that stimulate the processes of these reactions. And it turned out that magnesium is one of the most important cofactors. The beige formations that you see on the slides are the end of neurons. There is a synaptic gap between them, through which information is transmitted from one neuron to another by means of vesicles. What happens when magnesium is deficient? First of all, it is important to say that magnesium deficiency is quite difficult to measure, because magnesium is an intracellular element. Today, new technologies for assessing magnesium in red blood cells are emerging, but nevertheless, they do not always show a deficiency. The usual daily intake ranges from 300 to 400 milligrams. Relatively new British studies show that the aging process of the brain is slower in people with a daily magnesium intake of more than 500 milligrams. Please look at the many risk factors for magnesium deficiency. Separately, I would like to draw attention to coffee lovers. This drink is a diuretic. It actively removes fluid through the kidneys and magnesium is excreted along with the fluid. Also at risk are people who are very fond of salting food and their diet has an increased sodium content. People with intense physical activity are also at risk. Yes, sport is the prevention of sarcopenia and loss of muscle mass, as well as stress protection due to endorphins. But the risks of magnesium excretion through sweat increase, and losses increase accordingly. Also at risk are people who, according to the doctor's indications, take groups of drugs associated with diuretics or proton pump inhibitors. Individual diseases are also risk factors for magnesium deficiency. Summarizing the composition of stress relief, we see a surprising array of active ingredients. The combination of magnesium with glycine creates an effective duo in terms of neuroprotection. The dosage of L-theanine is consistent with the conclusions of current research. Components associated with antioxidants due to plant extracts have a longer-lasting anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effect. The box indicates the recommended basic course of 20 days, but I would recommend from a practical point of view to vary the duration of the intake depending on the situation. If you understand that you are waiting for a highly stressful period associated with a new project, relocation, or other exciting events, you need to start taking appointments a month earlier. This way you will prepare the body for more intense loads and consolidate the effect by continuing to take the product at the time of intense load and another 2 or 3 weeks after. Thanks to this scheme, the brain will survive an intense load with fewer losses. If we are talking about highly intellectual work, for example, exams or some project, there may be a shorter preparation in 2 weeks. Then 2 weeks in the active period and 2 weeks after. The convenient form of packaging also allows you to vary the intake. Soda for every day is packed in an individual bag. When a person is in intense mental processes, he can sometimes forget to take nutrients. And this form creates a stable habit. In addition to low concentration and the inability to relax too, a very big problem is related to sleep disorders. We have already touched on it a little when analyzing the L-theanine molecule. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we often steal from ourselves when we go to bed late. Sitting on the project, once again we plan to sleep on the weekend or next week. It seems that there is nothing wrong with sleeping one night on 3 or 4 o'clock. Despite the fairly high adaptive potential of our body, if we take sleep from the body on credit, it will definitely ask for it back. The work of our body is tied to circadian rhythms, the change of day and night inside our organs and tissues. There is a biological clock that affects the activity of these organs, the cycles of nutrition and fasting, body temperature, metabolic reactions, heat production, and the work of the microbiome. Our motor activity is also tied to a certain time of the day. If a person travels a lot between different time zones and stays in these time zones for an extremely short amount of time, you, the body, do not understand what time to adapt to. Also, in megacities, we are faced with excessive artificial lighting. People who have shift work schedules and night shifts in the long term are at risk of more light sleep and developing insomnia. Accordingly, circadian bias affects the basic regulation of hormones. Melatonin, as the basic sleep hormone, is released in us when it gets darker, but we delay this process by turning on the brighter lamps and the screen of gadgets. All this deceives our body, giving a signal that it is too early to sleep. All these imperceptible processes of circadian failures manifested by poor health. The next day, obesity and neurog increase the risk in the long term. Daytime diseases. After all, it is in the deep phase of sleep that the glymphatic system is turned on, which cleanses our brain of metabolites. Hence, the natural question arises, how to evaluate sleep? Of course, there is a subjective assessment of poor or good health in the scientific community. For these purposes, there is a standardized Pittsburgh sleep questionnaire, which is used by somnologists and neurologists to determine the quality of sleep. I offer you a short version of this 7-question questionnaire. What points are included in it? 1. Subjective quality of sleep. Think back to your last night and rate it on a scale from very good to very bad. The next moment is the time of falling asleep. For evaluation, you can use a gadget or determine subjectively. It took less than 15 minutes or more than an hour to fall asleep. 3. What is your sleep duration? And here it would be good to answer this question honestly. A lot of my patients admit that they sleep at 5 or 6 o'clock, because in the metropolis a lot of time is spent on the way to work, and in the evenings a large number of household chores accumulate. The fourth point of the interrogation is very interesting from the point of view of calculation. It is the effectiveness of sleep. It is calculated as a percentage through the ratio of time in bed to the time of real sleep. Here again, gadgets come to our aid, which can clearly show the total duration of sleep in each of its phases, as well as awakenings in sleep and their duration. The next point is just related to sleep disorders. The reasons can be different: going to the toilet, coughing, pain, uncomfortable climate in the bedroom, nightmares, snoring. It is important to understand how often you encounter this. Point 6. Use of sleeping pills. Here we are talking about medicines for falling asleep. How often you use them, and the last point, how much moderated or expressed. Do you feel daytime dysfunction? It can manifest itself as drowsiness. After waking up, yawning, unproductiveness, difficulty concentrating, and daily activities. Based on the results of the questionnaire, we can divide people into 3 groups: with good quality of sleep, sleep with reduced sleep quality, and with pronounced sleep disorders and a high probability of insomnia. People from the latter group are advised to consult a doctor to rule out concomitant diseases that disrupt sleep. These include a pathological condition in which episodes of respiratory arrest for 10 or more seconds occur during sleep, contributing to oxygen starvation of the brain. Or might you need cognitive behavioral therapy? Most people, of course, are in the borderline zone, when sleep disorders are not obvious, but already worsen their quality of life. But how are micronutrients and sleep related? I will share with you a quote from the amazing book The Physiology of Taste, which was written by gourmet Jean-Anthelme Brillat-Savarin in the 19th century. Whether a person rests, falls asleep, or dreams, he does not cease to be at the mercy of the laws of nutrition and does not leave the realm of gastronomy. Of course, even then the author was thinking about narrow gastronomy. What do we know about the relationship between sleep and nutrition from the modern point of view? As I said, various amino acids are precursors for the formation of neurotransmitters. That is why it is important how much protein is present in a person's diet, especially if there are sleep disorders. Within the framework of modern nutritiological recommendations, its amount increases and sometimes varies in the range of 1.5 or 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. It is also important to have different sources of protein because building neurotransmitters often requires essential amino acids that are not synthesized in our bodies. The next important point is related to carbohydrates. It is important for us to consume enough fiber to maintain the gut-brain axis so that our microbiome can support, including healthy sleep. Slow carbohydrates are needed for metabolic flexibility. There are studies with continuous glucose monitoring to assess the effect on sleep. We can see in real time the fluctuations in blood glucose in a sleeping person who wakes up from hunger. If you have this problem, you can add more slow carbohydrates to your last meal. For example, it can be bulgur or buckwheat. To maintain glucose levels in sleep for a long time, fats should not be excluded. Special sources of omega-3 fatty acids. It is also recommended to give up trans fats, which provoke inflammatory processes. Regarding omega-3 fatty acids, there are a large number of studies that show that they are not able to directly affect the quality of sleep. But in the long term, they reduce cardiovascular risks of neurological diseases, and promote health. Relatively recently, I came across an interesting publication as part of the study of the topic of neuronutritionology. The article analyzed the most studied molecules for quality sleep. If we look at this table, we will see here L-theanine, to whom we have already spoken. The duration of its intake can be prolonged up to 8 weeks. In dietary sources of these molecules, the dosage is indicated per 1 gram. We also see the magnesium and glycine we know, which are also used to improve the quality of sleep. We see the possibilities of dietary sources of these nutrients, and it becomes clear that it is difficult to get the necessary amount of magnesium and glycine due to them. We also see omega-3 fatty acids. They can be obtained not only from salmon and trout, but also from herring, sardines, and mackerel. But there are other interesting molecules that we haven't talked about yet. For example, melatonin, for which the evidence base increases, as well as valerian root, which many people associate simply with valerian from the pharmacy. Although in fact, this extract is studied in detail in terms of its effect on various processes. Let's start with melatonin, as the most studied molecules in terms of their impact on sleep quality. If we look at this scheme, we can see that the number of systematic reviews of meta-analyses and randomized trials is quite large. Melatonin is a hormone that is synthesized in our brain by the pineal gland. On the slide, it is marked with a small light yellow dot. Mainly at night, the pineal physis is able to regulate circadian rhythms, falling asleep, and the synchronization of the internal clock. Look at the huge numbers shown by the components of melatonin research around the world. More than 80% of studies show that melatonin works better than a placebo. It has its own reliable physiological effects. At the same time, the most stable effects of melatonin are reducing the time it takes to fall asleep and improving the quality of sleep. One of the largest recent meta-analyses suggests that melatonin reduces the time to fall asleep by 7 minutes. Someone may think that this is not so much. But this is a sufficient success if a person falls asleep for 23 minutes instead of 30, while easily connecting components related to sleep hygiene. Why is the data so insignificant in terms of total sleep duration? Because we need big data to get statistical validity. We are often interested not in the effect in minutes, but in the very existence of this effect. Why does it exist? Because the main effects are related to synchronization, with a decrease in hyperarousal and the effects caused by stress. It is believed that the results are not only related to a direct increase in the synthesis of one's own hormone. When taking melatonin, our own melatonin does not stop being synthesized. In addition, we see that from a molecular point of view, new receptors and mechanisms that can affect melatonin are being studied more and more. In general, we know that melatonin helps with jet lag from jet lag, as well as sleep disturbances from night work. But it is worth noting that a very important aspect is the dosage. The principle does not work with melatonin, the more the better. And when I periodically hear from my colleagues about the use of high doses of melatonin of 10 or 15 milligrams, the question arises, what will happen to your own melatonin? Therefore, the most common doses range from 0.3 to 5 milligrams. And it is very important that they should be used at the same time from 30 to 120 minutes before bedtime. It is also important to say that melatonin works better for people over 45 years of age, when their own melatonin is already less produced. In general, melatonin is well tolerated, but when using high doses, drowsiness, vivid dreams, and headache may appear. In general, the correct dosage is important. Now let's take a look at the components of valerian extract and the effects on sleep quality. The modern evidence base says that valerian is a medicinal plant that reduces hyperexcitability and anxiety. Traditionally, valerian has been used for insomnia, anxiety, and sleep disorders. Valerian contains not only valeric acid, but also other molecules that are studied from one point of view or another. What is important to say here? Is valerian more effective than mild insomnia, and not severe insomnia, as we considered on the Pittsburgh scale? Such insomnia is associated with subjective complaints about the quality of sleep, even if the indicators for gadgets are good. Modern meta-analyses show that valerian extract can have a positive effect on deep sleep, during which brain cleansing processes occur. We also see evidence of improved sleep performance from the Pittsburgh inventory that I showed you. These include reducing time to fall asleep, reducing nighttime awakenings, and improving sleep efficiency. But we are more interested in potential mechanisms of action. It turned out that valerian is able to affect the protein structures with which gamma-aminobutyric acid interacts. We have already talked about this acid in the context of L-theanine. Due to this effect, the activity of the sympathetic nervous system is reduced and a calming effect occurs. There are people who generally do not have problems with sleep, but their high anxiety can prevent them from falling asleep. Therefore, let's once again record that valerian works more effectively when a person has mild sleep disorders associated with stress, anxiety, and hyperarousal. It is also very important to pay attention to the fact that there are standardized dosages for valerian extract that are being studied. The effect of taking develops gradually, so up to 4 weeks of regular intake is required to accumulate the effect. Although some people subjectively can feel improvements even after one appointment. If the standardized dosages are exceeded, side effects in the form of dizziness or gastrointestinal reactions may be observed. I tell you this to show you the new Valeriana Forte product. This product was compiled on the basis of the evidence base that we talked about. The composition includes a dry extract of valerian with a moderate standardized dosage to have an anti-anxiety relaxing effect. In addition to valerian, other extracts are added here, which also have proven effectiveness against sleep disorders. For example, this is a dry extract of lemon balm, which contains rosmarinic acid, which has an anti-inflammatory effect and is an antiglycator. In addition, the product contains a dry extract of California poppy. It is safe to use. We are talking exclusively about safe dosages. Thus, for active phytocomponents create their own complex effect. We don't just brew tea from these extracts with a placebo effect, but we have truly standardized extracts with their own biochemical effects. And to enhance the effects, the product contains melatonin, but look, it is contained in a dosage of 1 milligram. As a reminder, when it comes to taking melatonin, more doesn't mean better, especially with long-term use. For example, a higher standardized dose of melatonin of 3 milligrams may be used in jet lag. But such a dosage is not required for long-term restoration of circadian rhythms. In this process, a complex effect is achieved by adding healthy habits and creating bedtime rituals, including a comfortable temperature in the bedroom and curtains that do not allow light to pass through. Now let's go back to the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Questionnaire and summarize how to integrate Stress Relief and Valeriana Forte into a stress management program. If a person has good sleep qualities, but there are periods of high stress, then use Stress Relief, which will continue to maintain good sleep qualities due to L-theanine and will provide stress cushioning due to magnesium and contained extracts. If a person has a reduced quality of sleep due to hyperexcitability, the time to fall asleep is increased and sleep disorders occur. Valeriana Forte will be more effective. If a person has a reduced quality of sleep and a high level of stress at the same time, then both products can be used. For example, you can use Stress Relief in the morning and take Valeriana Forte in the evening. Despite the fact that both products are recommended for use in the evening, in this case, from the point of view of chrononutrition, we will share the effect. I have already said that for people with severe sleep disorders and a high probability of insomnia, it is important to consult a somnologist in order to rule out some other reasons that may affect this. It is very important to understand that from the point of view of behavioral reaction, cognitive behavioral psychotherapy is also used for true and chronic insomnia. Combinations of both products may be allowed, but testing is necessary. Because we have both external stressors and internal individual characteristics. Due to the individual characteristics of the combination of two products at once, it can give morning sleepiness. In any case, thanks to systematization, we have the opportunity to get personalization, which we very often talk about in the context of longevity and stress management. If we combine these effective foods with a healthy diet, adequate protein intake, moderate daytime physical activity, and sleep hygiene, we have a unique strategy. Stress management, despite any external stressors, we will have an internal support of stress resistance, formed both by our daily actions and by effective micronutrients that keep us healthy. Of our brain, which means that we are approaching the main goals, the disclosure of human potential and, of course, the preservation of a high quality of life for pleasure and the implementation of all our bold plans. I wish you exactly that, and I really hope that together with these recommendations and effective products, you will be able to either maintain the high quality of life you already have, or come to it. I thank you for your attention and wish you new discoveries in neuronutrition and stress management techniques for brain health.